Mike Radich here, and I'm now joined on the phone by author Zig Misiak. Zig, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for asking. Zig, today we're going to be talking about the life and career of Jay Silverheels. You wrote a fantastic book about his life. The book is called Tonto, The Man in Front of the Mask. Today we're going to talk about his life and his career. We're not going to go too deep because I want people to read your book. So let's start back at the beginning. Jay was born Harold John Smith on May 26, 1912. What was his childhood like?
Well, actually, he was born Harold J. Smith, the initial J. And the reason I mentioned just J period, because nobody really seems to know what the J really stood for. And it's absolutely a coincidence that J-A-Y Silverheels is what he called himself later on. But even from his death certificate and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting thing about his J. But as a youngster, this way, and I'm, the Grand River Six Nations territory, which was occupied after the American Revolution. The Six Nations, a lot of them came up here in 1784. Well, that's, Jay's family was up and around here, and it was called a reserve. We refer to territory in Canada because a lot of changing things with the First Nations people. And the thing that saved his life, I suppose, in a lot of ways, in terms of stereotyping, bullying, put-downs, etc., is the fact that he was a tremendous athlete. Mm-hmm. So in elementary school, on the Grand River Six Nations, a little white schoolhouse, they had about 3 or 4 different grades in there. He was a student, but he was not too interested in, like a lot of young kids, in the academic part of it. Spent a lot of time out on his family's farm. Loved horses very, very much, and of course sports. Mm-hmm. Now keep in mind that his mother, when she was very young and came here from the other side of the Niagara River, like stateside, she was at an early age she was put into a residential school here. Now, residential schools were all over North America, really. And so his mom, when she came out about the age of 18 and that too, already had a pretty rough go in the residential school. But even at that, it seemed to work out okay, because Jay did not go to a residential school, mm-hmm. even though his age and the time that he was born, etc., residential schools were still pretty much around. He escaped that, and he had a little bit of a privileged life in terms of how privileged you can be on a reservation, right? His father ended up to be a captain in World War I in the Canadian Army and saw action, etc. But they didn't have high schools there on the territory, so he ended up going to high school here in Brantford, where I live. I'm 15 minutes away from the Grand River Six Nations, so he was bused up here, and didn't go on to school. There wasn't much chance of somebody that was Native or First Nations to go on, much after elementary school. So he quit, and that kind of led him into the soccer, and the lacrosse, and led him into California and Hollywood. But it was a typical Native kind of upbringing. There was one situation, I remember talking to his nephew, who's a good friend of mine, who's about my age, like 68 years old, and of course he says Uncle Jay, recalls quite often when people used to drive down there from outside the territory, and they would just drive down there and sort of stop, roll down their windows, and look at the kids, and they weren't treated as sort of normal or equal, So he grew up in an environment like that. He had not much of a hope. And it's fortunate that he made it the way he did, mm-hmm. In his career.
Mm-hmm. He was one of 11 children How was he able to separate himself from the pack? Was it his athletic ability? Was that how he was able to stand out? Because I'm sure in a household that has 11 children, it would have been very easy for him to fall by the wayside or be ignored or get lost. Was it his athletic ability that allowed him to separate from the pack?
Definitely. It was the way he separated. I know, for example, if I may name drop, I'm also a very good friend of the Gretzky family, and Wayne, of course, he did quite well in hockey. I was with his father here a couple of days ago, but even like in that family as well, there were, the one sister and three other siblings. They did okay in sports and everything else, but Wayne, kind of just went on. Like Jay Silverheels was very much the same way, or I should say Harry, because he didn't change his name until years later. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was his athletic abilities, and he just out of a large family like that, he just seemed to excel naturally in that area.
Mm-hmm. What was his dream? What did he want to do with his life? Did he want to be an actor? Did he want to be a pro athlete? Did he want to be, a professional man, doctor, lawyer, something like that? What was his dream? What did he want to do?
His dream was absolutely sports. He was. Lacrosse is the national Canadian game, but it's adopted from obviously the First Nations, because they played that for since the beginning of time. So it was sports. Even though he was quite good at just simply running, he boxed later on, a little bit, and he just wanted to make a living, and he tutored around here and there on both sides of the border, here in Ontario and down into the States, Buffalo, any place where his team would go, because they would pick up, a few dollars. And the acting thing was purely accidental. There was never any thought of that at all. He was spotted, as you know, by a fellow by the name of Brown, Joe E. Brown, mm-hmm. At a game in California, and because of his abilities, I mean, any athlete stands out. You get it in hockey, football, basketball. There's always that one person you zero in on, and it's really beneficial if you're not only a good athlete, but you're also a good-looking person. We know that in all sports, you get that combination. You have a personality. So he had that. Mm-hmm. So he drew to him, certain people, and so he was a little bit of a magnet, and got along with people well, and then got drawn into the Hollywood thing. But it was sports. But he didn't know where that was going to take him. Lacrosse was not lacrosse was lacrosse, even to this very day. Right. It's struggling, right, mm-hmm. As we all know. In the pecking order, what's first. I mean, you right up to the top, obviously you have your basketball, football, and hockey's in that, baseball. And lacrosse kind of just falls in someplace else, even though to be a great lacrosse player, you have to be bloody incredibly fit. Mm-hmm. So it was a day by day thing for him, literally day by day. The farm life on the Six Nations territory wasn't going to go anywhere. They were, squeaking out a living, with just taking care of themselves. His life was really going nowhere in terms of a vision. Keep in mind, it was illegal up until the 60s for somebody that was First Nations to hire a lawyer to go against your own, to go against, say, Canada if there was an issue. If you went on to post-secondary school, like universities or colleges, you also jeopardized your entitlement as a First Nations person to certain things. It would have created some issues. So he knew that, if he were to finish high school, that his future academically was really not going to be very good.
Mm-hmm. obviously, he's a great athlete. He played lacrosse, and he also did some boxing, so there's no doubt about it, he's a great athlete. But how good of a lacrosse player was he? Was he an all-star? Like, this is the guy, Harold Smith, this is the guy we got to look out for. He's the man. Or was he, he was just a good player. He contributed to the team. Good lacrosse player, but not the star of the team. How good of a player was he?
Well, you hit it right on, and that's actually interesting because here last year, I think it was last year, at the Wayne Gretzky Sports Center, we opened up a athletic hall of fame. Different people were inducted in there from a variety of places. In the one section, glass enclosed, are some artifacts from him and then other players. He was not the best player. He was certainly, you get a group of a dozen or so, or 15, he'd be considered as one of the top 3 or 4, but he was not the best. And that's been said by other people in a nice way. They say, well, he got his break into that limelight, right, into the Hollywood thing, and that's where he stood up, and of course his lacrosse thing kind of went along with it. Jay Silverheels, I mean, what a beautiful story, right, about his running shoes. And that's where he got his name from, because of, his speed that, and I write about it in the book that you mentioned, the biography of Jay Silverheels, right from a teammate of his who told the story. So, there's a little bit of legend there in terms of, him, and of course, he overshadows. Much the same way as, again, you look at any sport, I think all of us can. I mean, there are people that stand out. That was Wayne Gretzky better than a lot of the ace players on different teams throughout the league, or was he protected a little bit more, or was it just the timing, and or did other players help him achieve what he did, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very similar to him, that he was no doubt. I mean, he's in the Hall of Fame here, the Lacrosse Hall of Fame. But he's not in Canada's Walk of Fame, and I nominated him for that this year. I didn't get anything, to come back, because I'm not only nominating him based on the fact that he made a name for himself in lacrosse, but with the Actors Guild in California that he started, breaking ice for a lot of Native actors, as you know, to this very day. A lot of people will say that he kind of championed that cause. He wasn't loud and everything else too, in his own way. He did some things. So he was a good player, and the fact that he boxed and he met, it's a name that's even kind of a little older to me, like Jack Dempsey. He probably didn't get the training that he could have, because he got into it, for a short period of time and then kind of left it. So he had these natural abilities that I don't think the potential of his physicalness was realized either. Here we are, a native person. Like, who are you going to get, to train you? Where's the money? This and that, and everything else too. So I think he did quite well, even though he had, there were things that were going against him that way.
Did he like boxing? Because at that point in time, the late 30s, boxing was king. You had boxing, you had baseball, you had horse racing, football and basketball. Now they're, massive sports, but at that point in time, they weren't the major sports. Boxing and sports like that were the big time. So did he like boxing, or did he just pick it up because he was good at it?
Well, he liked it. I mean, it made him some money, the same way that he made some money modeling. And I don't think that modeling was something that he really wanted to do. I mean, he did all kinds of things. He by that time already, he had a couple of children. As I find out as time goes on, he actually had quite a few. Here and there. He had responsibilities. He's getting older, and he's seeing that, the traveling around and everything else too, that he had to make some money. When he did his boxing, it realized him some money, but there too, he soon saw that, if he's not going to be the number one, and then kind of move up into the ranks. I mean, he had the opportunity by meeting, Dempsey, but Dempsey had already met him. There he is, this native athlete that people had written about, this somebody had seen something in him, you know yourself that they would have put the hooks in him, and they would have used them as much as possible. But he was slight of build. He wasn't bulky, you know, in that. So he would have required a little beefing up and everything else too. But I don't think that he the boxing would have done him well. Even though he was aggressive on the lacrosse field, there are lots of accounts, you know, where he, you know, like any athlete, you know, that has something in their hands, whether it's a hockey stick or,
right.
you know, you whip a basketball to somebody's head, you know. So he could give and take, but it wasn't something that he would have that he seemed to, you know, want to go after, other than a few dollars when they were available.
Mm-hmm. What was his relationship like with Joey Brown? Because obviously Joey Brown, he's the guy who gets credit for discovering him. He saw him play in a lacrosse game, like you mentioned, and he suggested to Jay to give acting a shot. What was their relationship like? Were they really good friends? Did they hang out all the time? And then eventually, after they had become friends, that's when Joey Brown approached Jay and said, hey, we need to get you a screen test, you need to get out to California, you need to get into the movie business, and away they went. Was he friends with Jay, or was it something where they weren't really friends, they didn't really have a relationship? He just saw him at that lacrosse game one time, he suggested to him on the spot that he should go to Hollywood, and that was pretty much the end of the relationship. How would you describe their friendship? Did they have one?
Yeah, well, that's the way it was. Now, Joey Brown, I remember Joey Brown, like, you know, I'm 68 years old, so, I mean, he was slightly before my time, but I do remember watching him. I do remember him being very funny. If you mention Joey Brown now on the streets, you know, right. I don't know what anybody's going to think. They're going to say, oh, you know, what NFL team does he play for?
Sure.
He saw him on the courts. You know, you see this now even today, right? You see a lot of movie stars and everything else too. They live quite an exceptional life, so they get around to these different events. And this was an all-star, you know, lacrosse, and, you know, I could just see myself, oh yeah, hey, you know, we got tickets, you're going to be ringside and this and that and everything else too. And he, you know, it struck him, he had a chance to meet him. They didn't have any relationship prior to that. It happened, you know, around the courts, and Joey Brown suggested to him that he hang around, and that, you know, Brown could give him a little passageway perhaps to, you know, to some acting. I mean, there he is. Jay has no acting ability whatsoever, and of course here we go again. Oh yeah, sure. Like, what can I make out of it? So he stuck around a little bit in that Hollywood area, and not much happened. And he took off, and he came back home, and you know, did a little bit of, you know, searching around again, and then later on he went back again and hooked up with Joey Brown, and then he, you know, pursued that, you know, that Hollywood thing. And as we know, you know, he did doing the bit parts here and there, and then eventually getting his role as Tonto in The Lone Ranger was somewhat of you know, a fluke, I suppose. You know, that there he is. He's asked to audition because you know, of his personality and his looks. And I think it was a given that he was pretty much going to get the role, I suppose, because, you know, he what did he do before? A couple of bit parts? Even though I tried to research an awful lot of stuff, and I nailed down about 85 different movies he was in, you know, but, you know, a guy standing in an elevator, or shadow in the alley, you know, all these things. So he had really nothing, you know, going into it, and, like I say, going back again and saying, wow, this is interesting, and the rest is kind of history. So it took him a while too, right, to get some notoriety. Had it not been for his Tonto role, I don't think it would have gone. He would have gone anywhere, because even after that, as you know, what parts did he play? Only near the end of his life, when he had that one role as a lead ranch hand, did he have any opportunity to sort of show an ability that he had. He's used to the cameras, he's used to this, used to that, but it was pretty much on his looks, on his mannerism. Like, he had a very natural mannerism. He was very relaxed, laid back, he was a good-looking, like you guys say Indian, right? We say native person. So he was a good-looking guy. And it's really funny when I think about it too. The roles. Did he ever play, other than Tonto and the Lone Ranger? Did he ever play a main character as a native in Hollywood's heyday of the cowboys and Indians and the westerns? I don't think he did. They had guys from Greece or from Italy or wherever look,
right.
For a variety of reasons take on those roles. So he played a secondary role. He never played a lead role as a native person. It's really interesting there.
Right. Let's back up some. You jumped ahead of me a little bit. Let's go back to his name, Jay Silverheels. Obviously, we know how he got the name Silverheels. He was very fast. He was great at running. He had these white shoes, and a coach on one of his lacrosse teams gave him that name because all he saw was those white shoes running, and that's where Silverheels came from. But is it true that originally they wanted to give him the nickname White Heels, but they couldn't give him the nickname White Heels because he was an Indian, so they went with Silverheels? Is that true? You pretty much have it. The joke is when Pajagarlo was telling the story, after Jay had passed away already, a teammate of his, and he says, we couldn't really call him White Heels at the time, it wouldn't have fit. So that was the joke, and when you figure Silver Heels, White Heels, that whole thing. I mean, I see the name Silverheels. I've seen it around. I've seen it go back quite a few years in history too, but there's no connection. Like, where does Silverheels come from in these other places? I don't know. Like silver and heels. Who in the heck would have put those two things together? Other than his coach saying, "Yeah, look at that!" Like, it's just a blur. Silverheels, right.
And it sticks. That was that thing about, no, we're not going to do it White Heels, because it was bad enough as it was. When he played lacrosse at different places, it was tough. It was tough enough getting into the arenas when they played indoor, and it was tougher to get out when they won. They were pelted. They were called names. They were, it was pretty rough, and we know that, right? Through even the whole civil rights movement. We all know that. It's such standard stuff for the blacks, for the native people. What they had to go through, and so that's how that came about. Traditionally, and I know this, traditionally Six Nations or Iroquois, they have a native name. A lot of people there's a native name. I could never find a native name. Nobody ever was able. None of the family were able to say he had a native name. So his Christian name was, Harold, the initial J. Smith, and his father was a Smith, and his mother was a Smith. Two different families, and they ended up marrying one another. Two Smith families marrying. That was something in itself, to try to separate that. When I was looking back at his grandfather or great-great-grandfather, trying to trace that out. So then, as I mentioned earlier, the Harold, Jay Silverheels is what he, started to call himself, like with the lacrosse, with the boxing, with this and that. It's neat, right? But then it wasn't until about 20 or 25 years after he kind of made the move from this part of the world, down your way, that in California, and I write about it, I give the date in the book, that he made it legal, calling himself Jay Silverheels. So Harold J. Smith is not all that commonly known by many people. I mean, you know it. Anybody that's a fan of, the Lone Ranger fan club or anything else too would know that, but most people, you say Harold J. Smith, they wouldn't have a clue, let alone Jay Silverheels if you're not of a certain generation, right? and so on. So that's how that whole thing started.
Some people who are only fans of the Lone Ranger, some people who they know of Jay Silverheels and some of his other work, but they're not really fans of his, and some people who really don't know much about him at all, they'll say that his big break in the industry was getting cast as Tonto for the Lone Ranger TV series. Obviously, I was born in the 90s, so I wasn't around when he was making these movies and when he was making these TV shows. So I'm looking at it in the future. I'm having to go back to the past to study up and see some of his old movies. But it seems like, from what I've watched, his first real big break was in the 1947 movie called Captain from Castile, which was released by 20th Century Fox and starred Tyrone Power as the leading man. And Jay Silverheels, you were talking about it a little bit earlier. Jay Silverheels, he has that it factor. That's what we call nowadays those people who, there's just something about him. They got it. You know, obviously Jay Silverheels, he's a good-looking guy. He's an athletic guy. He's a funny guy. I've seen some non-Tonto stuff, some interviews. They're not the best quality. The audio's a little rough. The picture's a little rough. Stuff that was around the 50s. And he seems like a very funny guy, a very nice guy. He just has that it factor. There's something about him. You see him on screen and you're just amazed by what he does. And in that movie, Captain from Castile, he outshines Tyrone Power. Tyrone Power is a much bigger star than Jay Silverheels, and at that time, Tyrone Power was the man. He was the superstar, and in that movie, Jay Silverheels plays a Inca prince, and he just does an amazing job in that movie, and he doesn't have that big of a part, but his role in that movie is very crucial to the movie, because you see him at the beginning, and then he has a little bit of dialogue, and they talk a little bit, him and Tyrone Power, and then he goes away for a while, but he has a very crucial role in the movie, because he goes away for a little while, but then he comes back at the end. So I would have to say that that's his first big break, because this was a big budget movie. He's in there with a superstar, and he's outshining that superstar. So from 2015, looking back on his career, I would say that that's his first big break. But you've done the research. You've written a book on him. You've talked to many people who know him. You've talked to his family. You've talked to all those people. What would you say was his first real big break?
Well, you mentioned actually that particular movie. That was his break. That's when people saw him, paid attention to him. That's what Clayton Moore. You're hanging around. You know this too. I mean, movie stars now. I mean, Johnny Depp we got a whole armful of people. Out of the hundreds or thousands, I suppose, around, there's only a handful that we always know that they have this. I mean, they're like kings and queens. Well, it was even more so back then, because it wasn't as great a number, and the different film studios, they were just cultivating these people like crazy. They made them bigger than life, and of course the screen made everybody bigger than life, so it was much easier to access that group of people. Those celebrities like Humphrey Bogart, and that group. So he was in that circle, not completely in it, but he was among those people, and that was the break that gave him the here we have an upcoming thing, television. Well, black and whites, and it was just starting. How many people had TVs back then? But it's just like the internet. And that people saw. A couple of decades ago, say there's potential in this thing, and they wrote it. Just like television, people saw potential and they wrote it, and then out comes this Lone Ranger thing based on a lot of historical fact, which was interesting. I found. Including the fact that Jay Silverheels was a Potawatomi character. Even though he was Mohawk, he played the character Potawatomi, which is historically true. The Potawatomi were in Michigan, and a bunch of them were pushed down into Texas. Where he meets the character, the Lone Ranger, etc. But his you have to think really, really hard, and you say, well, I can't. You get Sidney Poitier, like in the '60s, Harry Belafonte. You get that starting to happen later, but around the time in the '50s. Mid to late 50s, very, very early, say late 40s. He's different. There's a native guy who actually is invited to go sit down at a table and have dinner with these white folks and everything else too. You wouldn't see that. That's again another reason, they didn't have a lot of Native people acting, because there was still this, don't forget, how long before that, what was Custer's Last Stand, in 1886 or something, so 30 years only have gone by. There's still guys that are around that remember reading that in the paper. So you're going to bring an Indian to the table, so to speak. And I know reading that they had guards earlier on, like in the 20s and that too, when they had a number of Native people that were going to play, roles as a large, like warriors. They had security around because they were afraid. They didn't know what was going to happen. So his break into TV was through that. I don't think. It's hard to say when I think to myself, well, if the TV break hadn't happened, if he didn't get that role, which was a major role, obviously, as you know, as Tonto, would he sort of faded into something else? I think he may have just played bit parts and gone on, because again, there's no strong evidence of his being on theater, like on Broadway, like a lot of actors do. They do that, or have gone. He never went to acting school, never had that. So if you're not playing the stereotypical role of somebody that like a native, or bad guy dressed in a suit, or look at John Wayne played Attila the Hun, for Pete's sakes. That was a typecasting horror show. I don't think that he would have gone on. He would have just faded in. I have a feeling that his Hollywood days would have been numbered, and who knows what he would have done. Faded out of that and gone on, and ended up as a machine shop guy or something. It was very loose. So that rubbing shoulders with the elite of the elite in Hollywood made him stand out, and bang, there he goes. For a long time, as you know, too, people that were Hollywood, like movie stars, didn't take any role on television. It was demeaning. It almost signaled the end of a career. But now you see, of course, it's not the issue. TV has become clearly over decades a massive, massive force, right? But it used to be, if you're on a talk show, that's one thing. But no, you wouldn't play in a soap opera. You wouldn't do anything else, let alone. And think to yourself, too, how many of these people, Roy Rogers, Hopalong Cassidy, Gene Autry, a guy that played Zorro, and so on and so forth, did they ever end up on the big screen? They were. I can't remember any of those guys ending up on the big screen. They ended up in their roles on TV, and that was that. So I think Jay too looked at it and said, "There's a steady income of sorts, and let's go for it." And that's what he did. And then, of course, when that finished, he went and struggled again to find roles of some sort. So he was, picking up this and picking up that, but never scored big. So his decision to do what he did, I think, was good. At least cast him in history. We're verifying that fact. The fact, here we are, umpteen years later, still talking about him. But it didn't catapult him ahead as a significant actor,
He's a perfect fit for the character of Tonto. Obviously, he has native blood. He is a very athletic guy. He knows how to ride horses. He has the voice. He has the perfect voice for Tonto. A lot of people think that he was the voice of Tonto on the radio show. A lot of people, hear John Todd's voice, the actor who played Tonto on radio, they hear John Todd's voice and they think it is Jay Silverheels. That's how close John Todd and Jay Silverheels' voices are, that a lot of people think that Jay Silverheels played Tonto on radio and on TV. That's how close they are. So he's perfect for the role, but he had to compete with 35 other actors for the role of Tonto. Was he the front runner going into the audition process?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, he had, Clayton, and he had other people, too, that were bucking for him, right? Like, Clayton Moore pretty much endorsed his coming in, and that was that. It's interesting you say he sounded like, because you take somebody with a southern accent, from the States, or somebody out east here in Canada, from Newfoundland or whatever, any male, they all sound very similar. You take a native person, because they have a different vocabulary, right? Like a French person, you hear any male, and they pretty much sound the same. You think back, and unless you're looking at the person, then you see that, here's a big guy talking like that, or a little guy talking like that. So his English with that native accent, would have been similar. But yeah, the thing that made him, there he was. He knew horses well. He could adapt to a lot of things. He wasn't that easy to work with, apparently, because he just came out and ad-libbed a little bit or whatever. This kind of stuff. He wasn't too enthusiastic about his roles overall. He didn't like the role. Right? Like there's a quote here when he was here in 1957 for a major event. What do you think of the role of Tonto? He just says he's stupid. Jay was not a stupid person, but Tonto was a simple character. Even though I thought, when you look at the reruns, I think he was interesting. I think that you have to, right. You see the humor, you see the camaraderie, you see his role. His role isn't exactly like Jingles or something, or Gabby, from Roy Rogers and so on and so forth. He was a little bit more up there, but he had the and so there's a guy that's thin, good looking, can ride a horse, has played a few other roles, knows some people. Bang, there you go. And I think his reliability. The fact that he'd been in other places, he had a track record of reliability, and all they have to do is check, because they didn't want to change. Once you get the guy in there, right, they don't want to change him when he's that visible. Suddenly, you got another Tonto here. On the radio, it's different, right? Like they had several. But, so he had people looking after him. I don't know at that point whether Joey Brown had influence, but Joey Brown seemed to disappear, never came out. But I think that relationship, was around. So you get a guy like him. If you heard through the grapevine, said, "Oh yeah, there's this role coming up," he probably would have picked up the phone and said, "Listen, hey, I hope you're going to get this guy in there because people like him. He's going to do well." And the rest is history, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Did he have mixed feelings about the show? Because obviously you just touched on it. You said that he didn't like playing Tonto. He didn't like the character. And on top of that, the working conditions were not good. He's working very hard. Back then they were doing 52 episodes a season, so he's working all the time in not good conditions. He has to wear that heavy buckskin costume in 90, 95 degree weather, and he doesn't even have a trailer to change in. He has to change in a gas station restroom and then drive from the gas station to wherever they were shooting because they didn't have a trailer for him. So he doesn't like the part, and the working conditions are no good. But on the flip side of that, he's getting paid consistently. He's working consistently. He's got some fame coming his way. Everyone loves the show. So did he have mixed emotions? Did he have mixed feelings about playing Tonto?
Absolutely, but at the time, he didn't know he was being. Don't forget, we're looking. It's easy now when you go on and you go on any of the social media stuff, and suddenly, some guy comes up with a poem, sings a little song, and ends up on American Idol. It's not. I mean, it's such an instant, celebrity thing. With television just happening and growing incrementally. Not everybody, not like now. I mean, my God, if you have one TV, you're poor. Like people have 3, 4. The fame thing was not the issue with him. It's again, he had he met Mary down there in California. He had the 3 kids that he was looking after. So he had a family to feed, and Hollywood didn't. Well, I shouldn't say Hollywood. The big screen people made a lot of money compared to today, virtually nothing. But the TV people were making a heck of a lot less. Clayton Moore was making more. There was a point, and I write about it in the book too, where Jay was getting changed in the gas station cubicle, because they didn't have anything for him. He finally says, "Listen, I'm not going to do this anymore." And Clayton Moore lobbied to get him at least a trailer, so they finally got him a trailer. So what he was making was not a lot of money. If you're looking at a few $100s a week back in the 50s, now, okay, somebody working in a factory was making $40 a week, and he was making, say, $200-300 a week. Yeah, that's like somebody making $40,000 and somebody else making $200,000. But $200,000 compared to somebody doing a movie and making $1 million, a huge difference. So he worked. Like, it wasn't like he could say, well, I'll do this Toronto thing, for 3-4 years, and when it phases out, I'm going to retire because I'm now a millionaire. It never happened.
Right.
That's one part. The other part, keep in mind, when I went back about his mother being in a residential school, that the people here in Canada, right across, coast to coast, the First Nations people were put on plots of land, and then different church organizations and government organizations went in and tried to take, kind of like the Indian, out of the person. And it's like, okay, we're going to assimilate you into society, and you're not allowed to speak your language. You're no longer the proud warrior that you were during the American Revolution. Your schooling was limited. You couldn't go outside your territory. People beat you up, and you had to stick around with your own. They didn't even have a hospital on the Six Nations territory. I mean, now they have about 20,000 people down there. They have a small, something like a medical station, but it was rough. And so he is a little bitter. When he came back to Brantford here, and he was standing on the stage, and I got that picture in my book, where he's standing on stage and he's crying, and his mother was in the audience, and she was crying, and talking to family here. I think I knew why. And why did he wear a suit? And why did he not wear his buckskin, kind of top that his one sister made for him, for the Tonto series? Because he wanted to show everybody that he could afford a suit. Oh, no, maybe not. Could he afford 10? I don't think so. But he could afford a suit. So he had this inside him, this thing. Okay, now that I'm quote unquote famous, everybody's paying attention to me, and you think I'm somebody. But that fame did not align itself with the money. The house that his wife's in. Now, the last time I recall, like 2 years ago, she was still alive, and they live in it was a 3-bedroom side-split bungalow. They bought that house in the 60s. Mm-hmm. Now that, to buy a new house in the 60s, yeah, it was a few bucks, but he didn't move into any kind of a mansion. He still lived in that bungalow. That just goes to show you what he wasn't making. The role itself, it did him well. Now, the other thing, too, to remember, do you think that there were residuals from the Lone Ranger series, or all these dolls and toys and games and stickers and everything else, too, that he got something for that?
No.
Absolutely not. That, and Jay had brought that out. Everybody, but the thing is, I say to people, I said, listen, after all, it was called the Lone Ranger. It wasn't called the Tonto. movie. You know, so if it's called the Lone Ranger is going to be the main guy, and Tonto just so happened to be the novelty part, right? So there were a lot of events that they went to or a lot of events that took place where only Lone Ranger was invited, and then Tonto was, when he came along, it was just, kind of by the by. You know, he was trying to squeeze out some money too, parades and this and that and everything else too, and he was just trying to eke out what he could on that fame. But you're right, the big players, the owners, took everything for themselves, and these guys just went off on their merry way. And Clayton got himself into trouble. But anyway, he just said, I think he said, just screw that. He's not going to do it anyway. Take me to court.
Right.
And I don't think that ever happened. But it's a different time. Interesting, I mean, you get a guy like Johnny Depp making $25 million or something on the movie now. And I actually liked the movie. I thought it was pretty neat in a lot of ways.
Oh boy.
No, honestly, but there's reasons.
Okay.
There's reasons. It certainly was, different. I mean, I grew up with it. I'm old enough. I watched the originals. But what was interesting to me was that the Tonto that Depp played wasn't as a stupid character. He had humor. He was on par with the Lone Ranger. I didn't like the fact that he looked an awful lot and acted an awful lot like Captain Jack Sparrow from the Pirates of the Caribbean. There was a lot of that license. But then again, when I looked at Batman and all these other, all the other characters, I looked at it and said, holy crap, man, look what Hollywood's done, to these people, So I said, well, in that context, was it really, really bad? If you ask me my preference, well, I'm very nostalgic about my Tonto and my Lone Ranger. That's there's no comparison. I mean, who in the hell, when you have to create the first of something, I mean, that's got to be mind-boggling. How do you create something for nothing? And they did. And as I touched on it earlier, the fact that whatever group of people wrote it, I mean, they really based a lot of it on fact, and even the timing, the Lone Rangers, what was taking place around that time, in and around the American Civil War, after, and Jay coming down, and then, saving the life, how was it? Yeah, he as a young guy, right? Tonto's life was saved by this wandering, guys that are always screwing everybody's life up, and then it reversed itself, of course, when at the massacre there in the valley where Tonto, saved his buddy, and recognized one another, and that friendship developed,
right.
So on and so forth. Like in simpler times, but I had to watch the movie. I had to know, but I call it Sponto in the book, Captain Jack Sparrow Tonto. As a matter of fact, I had Johnny Depp's lawyer call me after the New York Times did a phone interview on it, and I thought, well, he wasn't critical. He just said, Johnny Depp would like to have a copy of your book. I said, okay, great. But I made comments. I said, did you talk to anybody up here about Jay Silverheels in particular? Like, where did you get your sources from? I said, you took the original Tonto who was Potawatomi, and they were there. Apache and Comanche and Cherokee, they were Comanche and Apache they're the ones that go back further. I said, but suddenly you take the character who was Potawatomi and you make him into something that's unknown. You even take an image or painting called The Crow, and I spoke to the artist. He said that was a composite of many different nations, and he said Depp just liked the idea of the crow flying in the back of the crow was flying. You probably know this. It was flying behind.
Right.
Warrior's head, because I said, listen, you put a crow on a guy's head and you do a couple of miles an hour on a horse, that crow's going to be on the ground behind you about a mile. I said they were done for ceremonial reasons, as was the the white and the black that he wore, I mean, all that stuff. So there were a lot of things that I didn't like about it, but God, you fight Hollywood and you might as well be spitting into a hurricane. And so you either take it and you look at it and say, well, what out of that was positive? Well, it wasn't a demeaning role. It placed Tonto in a little better place. He wasn't the dork, the dummy, and so on and so forth. And then out of the fact that I enjoyed Johnny Depp overall, that was the other thing. But if I were to compare it to my old Lone Ranger and so on, no, I would not say, hey, put the old Lone Ranger movies into the archives. I said, no way.
Right.
You stick that one into the archives, you bury that one, and you leave everything else alone,
Right. I'll just let you have the last word on the movie, because I have nothing good to say about it. I'll just let you put it well. A lot better than I could have put it, so we'll just leave it at that.
I don't know. But look at the other movies that were tried, right? Like, there were another 2 or 3, and it stumps me that baby boomers in the public speak to those. They say, there's some things that you can change, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, cars, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, do I like an old, a 1965 Mustang? Well, sure I do. Compared to, that's just a choice. Like, you get nostalgic about it. But I think you take characters, you take things like this, you take something that doesn't have a breath or a heartbeat, and you say, okay, I can kind of live with that. But when you take a voice, a character, and you have that relationship and so on and so forth, it's different. And the long and short, you wouldn't get a thumbs up from me. Mm-hmm. Very enthusiastic. When you get a tiny one saying, okay, I can look at that and I can kind of just shake my head back and forth and say, you didn't turn my crank on it really big. It's not something I'm going to go out and start telling you gotta see this.
Right,
this is such a great thing.
Right.
But anyway.
Yeah. There was so much wrong with the movie. I don't even want to go there. But you touched on it. You touched on it a little bit earlier, and I'm glad you brought this up, because that was one of my main critiques of the movie. You were talking about how when Tonto was a young boy, his village was raided by renegades, and he was left for dead. And then John Reed found him, nursed him back to health, and then many, many years later, Tonto's able to repay the favor. He finds John Reed. He was ambushed by the Butch Cavendish gang, and then he has to nurse the Lone Ranger, John Reed, back to health. That's the one big missing piece in that movie, is the reason why they're doing what they're doing. Armie Hammer and Johnny Depp, they really have no reason to be friends. They have no reason to be riding together. It's just some made-up plot, or I don't even know what it was, that they got with each other, and they really weren't friends. They were kind of going back and forth. They really didn't like each other. Tonto is saying a bunch of stuff that the Lone Ranger doesn't really even believe, but he just wants to get the Cavendish gang. Like, it's all... One of the biggest problems with that movie is it lacks an identity. Is it supposed to be a comedy? Is it supposed to be an action movie? Is it supposed to be a horror film? I don't know. There's a point in the movie where Butch Cavendish is eating Dan Reed's heart. It scared me. I don't know.
Yeah, so you're right. It is a peculiar one, and I agree with you. The only sense, any sense of any kind of friendship, but it was a developing, because you didn't even know where it went, was at the end, where you assumed that they got along. They just, went through this one series of crises and everything else too. That it seemed that they were getting along and it was going to continue. Other than that, you're right. It was something that was developing throughout the whole movie. And you did wonder. You say, like, what, where are they, with this? Is certainly the Lone Ranger of old, you could see that there was a relationship, there was a care. I mean, like, one would throw themselves in front of the other, for the bullet, and and you're right, the depth was missed on how did that start. I thought that was a really, really important part that should have been included, and it wouldn't have taken long.
Right.
You know how they do the time lapse now. Some background, even if it was just narrated, and and you saw some sequence, and then you saw a little progression where suddenly the young Tonto, is a little bit older and kind of being
right
at the right place at the right time. I agree with you. Mm-hmm. It was dark. Mm-hmm. That's what it was. It's kind of like a dark, thing. If there was no relationship, if it was not called the Lone Ranger and it was just called whatever, and you go out and you'd say, okay, there's some silliness in there. It's humorous. There's some action. Even the action was a little bit uninspiring. But if it didn't have the title Lone Ranger, you'd see it for what it is, right?
Yeah.
There's Johnny Depp, and actually and I can't remember the guy's name that played the Lone Ranger. I actually liked him as a personality. He was pretty strong. Mm-hmm. Like he's. I saw him interviewed on. Jay Leno, I think, when Jay was still on, and he had a good personality. I liked that about him because I got to see him a little bit before I saw the movie. So him as a person, I seem to enjoy. But both of them, I think, went in there reluctantly. I think they knew that they had a challenge. I knew that I think they both knew that they had this enormous, iconic mountain. That they were, they were going into because they were getting paid great sums of money, but they could be called down for years later for how they tried to portray, the story and these two historic figures. I mean, historic figures and historic figures, right?
Right.
So on. So, yeah, I think the bottom line is they didn't fare well with it. I mean, it just. The box office showed the proof in the pudding, and even me, who makes exceptions, I'm pretty open-minded to a lot of things. I find it hard to defend it, other than just little bits and pieces, and say, the Depp character was a stronger character, where the original Tonto was maybe a little bit less, and this and that, and so on and so forth. It's just fun having those conversations, but nobody brings it up, and it's not a long lasting thing. It's sort of, here it is, it's done, it's finished, and yet the legends live on. Like we are having conversation now. We can go back to all kinds of the every episode and series and that too, and have a lot of fun with them, mixing it up and things like that. But that's not going to happen with the movie.
Right.
The other ones. Who remembers the other damn movies? That came out on the big screen, right? I mean, who in the hell remembers those? Just wow, they're just and I don't think the Lone Ranger deserves that. We have not seen a remake. Well, no, we have. We saw Zorro, but we haven't seen Hopalong Cassidy. We haven't seen Roy Rogers. We haven't seen any of these things, coming out, because you can't. Again, see, in each one of those, there's depth, isn't there? There's character of depth, and that's why the series were so successful, because one layered the other. Mm-hmm. Like in the Lone Ranger, there were these layers, like you were making a layered cake.
Right.
You weren't making a pie.
Right.
And they came out with a pie instead of a cake.
Yeah.
And there you go.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Yeah, they missed the mark on that one. They left out a big, the beautiful story. They left out. It's such a great part. They're boyhood friends. Then they go away for a long, long time. The 1981 movie, The Legend of the Lone Ranger, with Clinton Spilsbury and Michael Horse, that demonstrated that part of the story perfectly. I thought it was great. When Michael Horse comes down there, you can see the emotion in his face. He's ready to cry. He has that look in his eyes like, I can't believe, all these years I've been wondering what happened to that guy who saved my life, and now here he is, because he notices that necklace that he gave him when he was a boy. He sees it on John Reed, and you can see it, and then like maybe 3 or 4 minutes later in the movie, they scan forward, and Tonto's nursing him back to health, and then John Reed wakes up, and he's like, he calls him Kimosabi, and he's like, Tonto, like, I can't believe it's you. Like, it's just a beautiful part, and I really love the
Yeah.
The Legend of the Lone Ranger. I thought that was a great movie. Now, obviously, that had a whole bunch of trouble even before it got onto the screen. A lot of people had written it off because there was a whole legal battle with the Radler Corporation and Clayton Moore. But I thought that was a really good movie. You know, has a pretty good cast. I mean, Clinton Spilsbury's a little stiff, but it was his first movie. I don't think he's that bad. And you mentioned Armie Hammer, who played the Lone Ranger in the 2013 movie. Every time I watch that movie, I just look at it like, you know, this guy, he's a pretty good actor, but every time I see him, I go, if it was a Lone Ranger TV series episode with Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels, he would be like the doctor or the young lawman or somebody that they were helping. Like, he just looks like one of those guys that the Lone Ranger would have helped out rather than the guy who would have been the Lone Ranger. That's just how I feel. But
you know, when you mention that, I'm following that because that's an excellent way of putting it. I agree. A nice way of putting it. That he could have been cast as a secondary character as opposed to a primary. You know, absolutely right. And you're right. Going back to the Lone Ranger movies, that there were elements, you know, certainly there. But you know what? If you try to remake anything, and if the initial thing that you're trying to remake had turned out to be excellent and you know, had depth and you know, entertaining and all this other kind of stuff, you're challenging yourself. You know, like you're saying, what the heck, you know, you'd almost think that they would have been better off doing it in black and white for starters,
right?
For a lot of different reasons, you know, to kind of maintain at least that integrity of something that might be original. Right. And you're right, yeah. When you miss that beginning part, because all the way through, right, you never forget that. It's in the back of your head. Their relationship. How did it start? It's always there.
Right. Right.
It's always there. It's there. It may not be foremost in your mind, but something might come up and you say, you know, they would say that. Sure, this is how they would be. This is how they would, you know, react and so on, so because it's a long time, in the frontier, in the West, right? In those chaotic times, friendships, I think, were at a premium, and they had this most amazing thing, and you know, it's interesting.
The 2013 movie, every time I go back and see it, you know, I've seen it a couple times just to scare myself at night. No, I'm just kidding. But every time I go back and watch it, I just think, like, they really dropped the ball there, because the producers and all them, they really disrespected the source material, because there's hints of it in the movie, but at the same time they're making fun of it. Like, I always remember a movie called Zorro the Gay Blade. It was a comedy with George Hamilton playing a dual role, and it has some of the best action sequences in the history of Zorro. They have a little fight in the mansion with the alcalde and Zorro. It's great, even though it's a comedy, but they never cross the line of putting down the character of Zorro. They never make fun of what makes Zorro Zorro. Now, in The Lone Ranger, they were making fun of a lot of things. You know, the Hi-Yo Silver at the end of the movie, Tonto looks at him like, never do that again. I don't know what you were thinking on that one. And then there's all these other things that they were putting down about each other, and it just didn't make sense, you know. And I was so confused about what I was seeing. Am I supposed to be laughing in this movie? Because how I was when I went into the movie thinking about it, and thinking about what I was about to see, I thought it was going to be like Batman Begins. Like, we were going to strip away everything and get down to the core of what makes this guy tick. You know, why is the Lone Ranger the Lone Ranger? And the first trailer showed that. You kind of saw a dark and serious version of the Lone Ranger. Then the second trailer, all of a sudden, we have the Lone Ranger screaming when he got shot in the air in the shoulder with an arrow. We saw all kinds of comedy coming out. So I'm confused on what I'm seeing. But you know, it just really lacked an identity. And it went too many different places. You know, Tonto, the flashback or the flash forward, I don't know what you want to call it, with the little boy when they were at the World's Fair. I didn't think that was necessary. They could have done without that. But it's just a really confusing movie, and a movie that doesn't really do it for me. I'd much rather watch Jay and Clay do their thing. So, anyways, we kind of got off on this.
Well, I love listening to you because you wrap it up, you know, that way too. You hit on a lot of points that I couldn't express, but I'm sitting here nodding my head and saying yes. So I think the consensus is that we feel about that. Yeah, it was too loose. It's almost like several people had written the script as opposed to one person with a train of thought. Or if it was one person, they woke up the next day with something else on their mind.
Right.
But you're right about the whole thing that, you know, at the end, you know, of the series, now there was a message, there was a warning thing, there was you know, we have to collectively work together, and it's such a beautiful relationship at a time, even historically, when you went back, to the 19th century, where a white guy and a native guy, you know, would not have had a relationship like that, and it was ahead of its time. It was showing something really neat. That there they are. They both have the same cause. They care for one another. They both, you know, evil is evil. Doesn't matter, you know, what language or what color where you are. And the message and the safety for the people. Say we're around here, and we're gonna help look after everybody. But you got to help us out too. And at the same time, having that, like you had pointed out clearly, the financial security that they have, that you know, if there was even more depth into it, like how many more things were they able to do for people, you know, beyond just looking at, you know, watching these guys that wanted to take something that belonged to somebody else, and you know, the whole philosophy, the whole you're right, the whole sense of it, the kind of the you know, the historical, the spiritual, the humanity of it, and the simplicity of it, you know, the purpose, you know, was and that's what I said. I every time I think about this one, it's dark, you know, it's dark, and no, but you know, you hit a lot of excellent points that give me food for thought too. You know, and that as well. You know, it's good for you.
Yeah. Let's change gears a little bit and get back to Jay Silverheels. And I wanted to ask you this a little bit earlier. What did he know about the role before he was cast as Tonto? Did he know it was going to be a, quote, stereotypical role? Did he know what he was getting into, or did he think it was going to be totally different from what actually happened? What did he know about the role before they started shooting the early episodes?
Well, from what I understand, talking to family and everything else too, that he had a sense it was going to be different because, you know, suddenly he's asked to be a significant co-star in television that was going to potentially reach more people than the big screen. And so there was something about that in itself that he felt was really going to be unique. The scripts, of course, you know, he didn't have input into them other than when he was on set. You know, I say sometimes he'd, you know, kind of forget a line or something or ad-lib a little bit, but I think the integrity of it in terms of knowing that he had a very nice position as a character with the Lone Ranger, and then of course even in their lives, you know, just outside of that they were making history too, weren't they? Like you had pointed out too, like at a time when, you know, just after World War II, the turbulent times of social equity and everything else that was taking place, and this great series had these messages in there that helped bridge a lot of this stuff. There's no question. Look at the impact it had on the young kids. You know, I don't think when I was growing up and I was watching this that I was aware per se saying, oh, okay, you know, this is life changing. But obviously, you're trying to mimic a situation or a hero, and you say, look, it's okay. Like they're hanging out with Native people, or they're making nice comments about, you know, Orientals, or there's, you know, we don't like evil. You know, get involved, try to do something, and you know, all these different things. So it's you know, it has, when you analyze it that way and you look at it from, you know, from our eyes in 2015, it was so progressive, I suppose, and timeless, like that message, which I think in its purity is comforting. You say, wow, you know, there it is. Bad's bad, good's good, and do what you can, instead of all these other things that are coming out right now. It's so complex and screwing people's heads up. But his sense of the whole thing was just that. So he had an opportunity there to showcase himself, of course, right? As I mentioned earlier, like he was out there, to make a living, and then also to make a statement. And that's around the time when he had that influence to create the guild for Native people, right, to help Native people train, to give them as a group some leveraging to play parts that were not demeaning parts, et cetera, and not necessarily always the role of a Native person. There's a Native person, but he can play the role of, like he started, like I said, near the end of his career, when he ended up to be that lead hand at a large ranch. So you could look at him and say, he's a Native guy, but he's not a lead hand because he's Native, and so on. So I think, from my understanding with family and that too, that he saw opportunities there, and as it went on, you saw things develop. I have a Native Studies guide that's in 685 schools in Ontario, and I remember my first phone call a few years ago. Hello, school. I have this Native Studies guide that's going to help you in your classroom. It's going to help the teachers teach First Nations history, culture, and all kinds of teachable subjects. Oh, wow, sounds really great, Zig. Well, how many schools is it in? Oh, well, if you order one, you're going to be the first. Now, it's like, hello, Zig, I've got this. Oh, really? So you have a different power, and he developed that power, and that's why one of the big things that I've noticed, I've seen, even photographs here when he loved young people. He'd go to hospitals. Young people, I'm even wondering whether young people forgot the fact that he was a Native. They look at him as Tonto, and of course they see, right, the features and everything else, that he's Native, but they didn't look at him as, a guy jumping out of a tree with a scalping knife that's going to, butcher on the spot, or whatever Hollywood was even doing at the time. Right. That he was a human being, that he could speak, he was sensitive, he had children, and so on. So he took advantage of that for sure. But on the other side, we talked about earlier that the remuneration or the finances never came that way, which had to hurt him an awful lot for all the good things that he was trying to do. But that evolved, because you pointed out, the script evolved, the black and white went to color, the popularity. I think I don't know this for a fact. Like I haven't looked at, say, statistics, but I would, unless I'm just biased about it, I would have to say that the Lone Ranger was probably the most popular TV series of its kind. Is that your sense of it?
Now that you mention it, from the information I've been able to gather, during that era, it's really a two-horse race, depending on what you consider to be the most popular. It's either the Davy Crockett craze with Fess Parker, or it's the Lone Ranger, because everyone's going nuts. I've seen so many photos that have been in the archives, they've been buried in, because I'm from Michigan, so I'm here from where it all started.
Yeah.
George W. Trendle and Fran Stryker, they created it on WXYZ in Detroit, and they have a celebration every year in Oxford celebrating the life of Brace Beamer, who played the Lone Ranger on the radio. The reason why the Lone Ranger is still popular is because it's a great show, it's a great character, it's entertaining, and it's universal. Anyone can watch this show. Men, women, children, it doesn't matter your race, your religion, your nationality. Anyone can watch this show and be entertained, because the Lone Ranger would help anyone. He doesn't care what the color of your skin is. He doesn't care what religion you believe in. He doesn't care what country you come from. He only cares that you're on the right side of the law, and if you're in trouble, he'll help you. And we need more of that these days. We don't have a lot of that. And that's why this character is such a great character, because it's universal, and it's still very relevant to what the world we're living in today. Look at the Lone Ranger Creed. It was written 80 years ago, but everything in there is still so very relevant to the world we're living in right now. So that's why the Lone Ranger is still very popular, and that's why he's a much more popular character than Davy Crockett. And I always say the only people who don't enjoy this show or don't enjoy this character is because they haven't been exposed to it. That's the only way you don't like the Lone Ranger. That's just how I think.
Yeah, and you know, when you mention Davy Crockett, of course, he had the power of Disney behind him, right? But and then listening to you again saying that the life, how sustainable the Lone Ranger has been, but when you talk about, say, Davy Crockett or even Daniel Boone, I suppose, you know, as well, but Davy Crockett in particular, it's not as global. And topical at the time, possibly, right? Because of the frontier thing.
And not to cut you off, but that was the main reason for the popularity of Davy Crockett, because they were originally going to go with Zorro before Davy Crockett, and Walt Disney looked around and he's like, you know what? Right now, the real thing that American people want to see is they want to see real American heroes. And Zorro, you know, he's an American creation. Johnston McCulley's as American as anybody. But Zorro, he's from Spanish California. We gotta change gears here, because they had spent a bunch of money to acquire the rights to make Zorro, but they looked around and like, you know, the one thing that's really selling here right now in America is real American heroes. So let's go with Davy Crockett. And I think that's why. Had it been something different, had it been Zorro, it's the Lone Ranger in a landslide. Had it been another character that they had acquired, like Superman or something, it would have been the Lone Ranger. I think that's what positioned Davy Crockett and that craze as, okay, look, this, you know, the 50s and all that, this is really, you know, all American, you know, let's go in for our own. And I think that's why Davy Crockett was so popular.
Absolutely, and it's an interesting thing about the two different time periods, because you have the one, Davy Crockett, at the beginning of, say, the evolution of the United States, and then the Lone Ranger and the Tonto kind of well into it. I mean, now you're coming into, you know, the later part of the 19th century, post-Civil War, you know, a lot of these things. I mean, God, you're not that far from World War One. 30 years in World War One's happening. But yeah, different time, and I can see. I like Davy Crockett a lot. I mean, I like the you know, the wilderness. I like the you know, that whole thing.
Love it.
And Fez Parker, of course, was just such a likable character, right?
Yeah, love it.
And his whole personality and so on. But yeah, different time periods. But yet the, you know, you say, well, how many people? They would say David, they remember, but would they be able to remember, say, the series and the messages and all that kind of stuff? Where Lone Ranger, Tonto, there was always this. You know, this message, and you're right about the creed. You look at it, and it's pretty damn good stuff. You know, like reading it, it's very interesting.
The Lone Ranger is by far the greatest superhero ever created. A lot of people get mad at me when I say that he's a superhero, because a lot of people say, oh, what makes him a superhero? He's in the Old West, and he doesn't have any superpowers. But he does have a superpower. His superpower is his humanity. Like Batman. Batman has no superpowers except his humanity. And Batman and the Lone Ranger are very, very similar. People get mad at me all the time when I compare the Lone Ranger to Batman, but there's so many elements in their character that reflect one another. The Lone Ranger, he wears a mask. Batman, he wears a mask. Batman, he is very wealthy. Bruce Wayne is a billionaire. The Lone Ranger is also wealthy. People forget about his silver mine. That's how him and Tonto are able to support themselves, and that's why they never take any rewards. He has his silver mine. That's where he's churning out his silver bullets. They both have sidekicks. Batman has Robin, and the Lone Ranger has Tonto. Neither one of them kills. The Lone Ranger doesn't kill anyone, and Batman doesn't kill anyone. They were both born out of tragedy. Bruce Wayne saw his parents murdered right in front of his eyes. John Reed was orphaned in an outlaw raid, and then years later he witnessed his brother's murder at Bryan's Gap. And both their missions are to make sure what happened to them never happens to anyone else. That's their goal. Their mission is not to get revenge on the people who did what they did to make them become who they are. When it comes to the Lone Ranger, his goal is not to get Butch Cavendish, kill him, and then have it be over. Batman's goal is not to find Joe Chill, kill him, and then it be over. And on top of that, they have a sweet ride. The Lone Ranger has Silver, and Batman has the Batmobile. But then that's where the comparisons end. And the Lone Ranger always was a better character in my eyes because he does things a lot different than Batman. Batman is someone who is this dark character. He hides in the shadows. He only comes out at night. Because of his costume and his appearance, he tries to strike fear in the hearts of the criminals and the murderers that he's tracking down. And the Lone Ranger, he does things differently because he's on the clock 24/7. He never stops. He's chasing bad guys in the daytime. He's chasing bad guys at the nighttime. And he's a nice guy. Batman is not a very nice guy. He's always angry. He's always growling. He's not the nicest guy in the world. He comes out at night, so you never really see him that much. He hides in the shadows. The Lone Ranger is a nice guy. He smiles. And the one thing I love about him is that he's nice to the people who are on the right side of the law and the people who are law-abiding citizens, but he's mean to the outlaws. He's mean to the people that him and Tonto are chasing. So I always like that about him. The Lone Ranger is a very nice guy. You look at Clayton Moore, he's always smiling. He's always very nice. So that's what I always liked about the Lone Ranger. And on top of that, why I always thought that the Lone Ranger was a more interesting character and the best character is because he's a resurrected character in a roundabout way, because he doesn't have an alter ego. His alter ego is technically dead. John Reed died at Bryant's Gap. The Lone Ranger is who the man is. He's not John Reed anymore. He's just the Lone Ranger. The guy that he once was no longer exists. And I always thought that was very cool. I always thought that it's a resurrection story. He has a grave in Bryant's Gap that's unoccupied, but it is occupied at the same time because his former self is no longer who he is now. He's become the Lone Ranger full time. And I always loved his disguises, and I always loved that mystery about him. I always loved that you didn't know where he was coming from. You didn't know when he was going to show up. You didn't know where he was going to show up, but then he suddenly appears and he helps the people. I always loved that about the Lone Ranger, and that's why I consider him the greatest superhero of all time. He has a superpower. It's his humanity, and on top of that, if you can call Batman a superhero, you got to call the Lone Ranger a superhero, because what does Batman do that the Lone Ranger doesn't do? And that's why I always thought the Lone Ranger was and is the best superhero of all time, and that's why I love that show so much.
Yeah, but it's so beautiful to see this. I mean, as a baby boomer I am, and to see that, your wish is this. When you have a family, you have children. There's certain things that you want to have carried on. And when I see the fan club, and I see the interest and the intensity and the conversations and everything, it's a big smile to me, because it's certainly something I'd grown up with, and the torch is being passed on. Mm-hmm. And I bet you in a lot of cases, not just in the bigger picture, with more intensity. We grew up taking it for granted. There it was, and you'd go to the store, you had your guns, your this and that, everything else too. We never thought that there was going to be an end to it, or whatever it was. And as kids, we didn't. What was taking place then, and how we viewed the end of an episode is not. You look at it and view the end of the episode now. The creed itself too. When I was a little one, did I really, other than knowing it was very nice, it was a feel-good thing. But now I look at it differently, like you, and you can look at it and say, "Holy crap! This is pretty interesting." Or even the fact that the historical context, with how it was made, and like you say, Michigan, the beginnings and all that stuff. That's not a thought that we given. So to see people, younger people, with that knowledge and intensity is. It's a big smile. It's mind-boggling, And what do you see that in other situations? Songs, I suppose, too. Going back to 60s, 70s. But not something like this where there's, it's a continuation and there's words. Because you can move back and forth, right? You can go from the series, you can go to the lead up to it, you can go to it, you can take, after the cameras they stopped rolling, what happened, and then post Lone Ranger, the continuation, where'd everybody go, what did it mean, and hence, I mean, it was an education for me writing the doggone book. I was looking at things in there. I said, "Wow, I didn't know this." Frankly, I didn't. I shouldn't say I didn't care, but unless you're kind of looking at it and digging up this information, you say, "Wow," and then you try to tell other people about it, and there's a story of this person, this one segment in his life that, and to the end, right, Clayton Moore and his words at the burial of. I mean, I think he couldn't make it, but he certainly wrote, part of the eulogy. There was something he wasn't feeling well himself, couldn't make it to the funeral itself. But whatever they were going through, the two of them separately, together, or some arguments and this and that, or you're getting more than I am, or whatever. They had this. I don't think either one of them knew that they were history. They were living and breathing historical figures on so many different levels. And nobody talks about the writers necessarily and saying, "Boy, you guys wrote something here and you filmed something here that is unbelievable." No, it was the two characters, those two individuals that we see, right? That we take into our hearts and souls, and we can hear them. And then you see all the things that they were doing outside of that. Mm-hmm. Some not so nice because they were trying to eke out a living out of, they got shafted. Mm-hmm. The big guys gobbled up, a lot of their money. But a lot of these things is, you'd ask me a question, I think, that led into, the what they were able to do as stars and their power, how much influence they had on people. Mm-hmm. I think in view of a lot of things that are going on now, this morning, and I go, geez, every time you turn something on about this ISIS stuff that's going on, all of these things and all these anniversaries are coming, especially with Remembrance Day or Veterans Day, right? That's a time of recollection, nostalgia, and I go back to those simpler times where everybody was brought together, post World War II. We were all together, and the TV series just reinforced that. There's that togetherness. Bad things are not going to take over. We won't allow that, even if it's just individuals. But those guys, they rallied. I mean, but they were able to rally. They were able to instill in people that were, got to be together on this thing. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very interesting. I know the family. When I finished the book, of course, I had the blessing of the family too, and being the first biography, written of them, and it's incomplete. I still get people, showing me things or telling me about things, et cetera, that I say, geez, I could make this book about 8 inches thick. Right. But it at least it puts it out there in an assembled version that you can take it apart. It's like the plate. It's like the meal put in front of you, and you can look at the meat and the veggies and all that stuff, and you can just look at it together on the plate, or you can have little morsels, or you can say, geez, the steak could have been done a little bit better or something. But unless it's in front of you, unless you have something to work with, right? Like you were saying, you watch the remake, and in order to see it, you need to see it to be able to make comments about it. Mm-hmm. I've heard people say, I'm not going to see that, and I'm not I don't, you need to look at it to make a comment, one way or the other. Don't just say, I just don't like it. How can you say that? Without giving good reasons. And you and I spoke at great lengths about the reasons why it doesn't have that appeal. What was missing in it was shallow. So it's like I say, so it's like my book is putting it out there, and the images and the photographs and these commentaries, And the timing, which was not planned, of course, with the movie coming out. The fact that I have Depp on the front, or kind of like an image of him, I wanted to show that Tonto and the Lone Ranger, of course, in their simplified kind of, almost like comics would have been done back then, right? That was intentional, and then a more detailed Depp version, so people would look. So the younger generation, even kids that are in elementary school, grade school, would look and say, "Oh, okay." I wanted to invite younger people to look. Who is this guy? And I do a lot of talks, and I bring up images and so on and so forth, and I say, "This is who this guy is." This is before Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam to them, I might as well be talking about making the pyramids.
Yeah.
It's all ancient history, but at least in context, me, and they're looking at me, and what effect did it have on me, and beyond that, it's just an interesting exercise. I just shake my head even thinking about it. That I even stood on the same stage that he was on here when he was crying. I got this acknowledgement from our country about contributions to history and culture, and I stood there, and I don't even know what the hell the guy was saying. I was just looking out into the seats. When I was a kid, I was on my hands and knees in and out of the aisles, in a matinee, picking up bubble gum or change that fell out of somebody's pocket.
Right.
After watching something, and I'm there, and one of the two icons stood on that stage, within a few feet of where I was, and to be there and just say, "Wow, this is mind blowing," And then I say the Lone Ranger Fan Club and all the other interests in it, that this is a continuation. Like there's no grand reason, but the intensity of people like yourself, the passion that you have for this to carry it on. And if you had to write a paper, why do I feel that this needs to be carried on? Why am I so passionate about it? You could write an awful lot, and maybe not even hit the nail on the head. Maybe you really, really can't identify the reason, other than the fact that it's there's a hell of a lot more depth on there than just turning on a tube and seeing some guys riding around on a horse shooting guns, A lot more, especially in today. I think even more so today, that has a lot more relevance. It's times that were simple and gone. It's complicated now, confusing for a lot of people. The baby boomers like me growing up and saying, "What the F," like especially again around the veterans. I interviewed several of them. I had 95-year-old I was standing beside. He was getting all confused talking about D-Day, and my heart broke. And he was leaning over to try to touch the screen to show the landing craft, because the Canadian forces, they landed here, and then American forces were there, and so on and so forth. And it just went over a lot of stuff, and I'm thinking too, it's a different time, and his sadness into where the world's going. So the Lone Ranger, it was a sign of hope, wasn't it? There was hope there, and I think maybe in part you want to carry on that hope, through that, as I do, and say we're too complex. So somebody took a modern version based on modern thoughts and modern ideas, and we could see what it did. It actually did not. It did not hold up that flame of hope. Didn't do the same thing as the original, TV series and all that kind of stuff.
Getting back to Jay for a minute here, during season 4 of The Lone Ranger, he suffered a heart attack and was replaced for 5 episodes by Chuck Courtney, the actor who played Dan Reed, the teenage nephew of the Lone Ranger. When Jay suffered this heart attack, they did a good job of masking what was really wrong. They just said that Tonto was visiting friends, or he was visiting the Padre, or he was going to Washington to receive some award. But he did suffer the heart attack during the 4th season. What caused it?
Part of it is genetic. When I look, talk to the family here too about what's in the family, right? We know more about that now than we ever have. And for a guy that he wasn't obese. When you change a diet, and this is factual too. Well, look at say the black population. Like they're more susceptible, it seems, to sugar diabetes and high blood pressure. Right? Mm-hmm. It's just something that with North American diets and that too. Even though they've been here, for centuries, but it's the introduction of things that their bodies haven't acclimatized to that. Where he here, his food was so simple, homemade food. Stress level was basically minus, and so on. And he goes to that environment. He's not as active anymore. He's not, doing the lacrosse. He's not riding out in the field full tilt and everything else too, and eating out more and everything else, and the stress of family and production and that too. So it was just a composite plus the DNA, the genetics. Because he had another bouts at it. The last one of the last photos when him and Jonathan Winters with the laying of the star in Hollywood, you could see his face was it was a stroke. You see the paralyzed and everything else too. So it's a combination of things, lifestyle and his makeup genetically.
Did he ever fully recover from that heart attack? Because obviously he died in his 60s. He was still a young guy when he died. In my eyes, some people think that 60 is old, but in my eyes, I don't think it's that old. And he died quite young.
Well, yeah, I believe he was 68, right? Yeah. 1980. Mm-hmm. No, he didn't recover, and that was before because once you have a situation like that occur, your arteries and veins in your heart and that too, it gets scarred. And unless you change, things like anybody would tell you, you'd say, well, you have to stop eating this and you have to do this. He wasn't, smoking was not an issue. I don't even recollect anybody saying to me that he smoked cigarettes. Drinking, even Steve here, his nephew, he said when he went down to California to visit, he'd say Uncle Jay would have, some wine and so on, so he wasn't a boozer. Alcohol with Native people is an issue too, right? Their resistance or tolerance towards that is lower than others, again, for a lot of historic reasons. And but he wasn't abusive that way. But the scar of fighting something like that, and the treatments back then too, they weren't as they are now. Right? You can get all kinds of things, and you can get much better comments in terms of what you need to do, to help yourself along. But 68 years old, to me, God, when you say I'm 68, and I could lose a little bit of weight, but we're more aware of these things, and to the best of my knowledge, it's not in my family makeup either. But once you're scarred, and you become weaker.
Mm-hmm.
That's what happened with him.
Mm-hmm. He played Tonto for all 5 seasons of the Lone Ranger TV series from 1949 to 1957. He appeared in 2 feature-length motion pictures, first in 1956 with a movie simply titled The Lone Ranger, distributed by Warner Brothers, and then in 1958 he appeared in The Lone Ranger and the Lost City of Gold, and he has an outstanding performance in The Lone Ranger and the Lost City of Gold. There's a point in time where he has 15 minutes of the movie where he just completely shines. He has a great performance in that movie. That might be his best overall performance as Tonto, and he appears in the most episodes out of any actor. John Hart replaced Clayton Moore for 52 episodes in the 3rd season, so Jay Silverheels' 216 episodes is the most any actor appeared on that TV show. There were 221, but like we said earlier, in season 4 he suffered a heart attack, so he had to miss 5 of the episodes, so that's why he's at 216. So he had a very long and very successful run on that show. So I'm just curious, when the show ended, was he happy? Because now, I'm sure he thought, hey, I was just on this hit TV series. People are going to be lining up at my door ready to hire me. Was he happy that the show was over because now he could pursue some of the roles that he thought were coming his way? Or was he sad because he knew, hey, you know, it's pretty tough in this business to strike gold twice and be on a hit like this? Was he happy or was he sad when the show ended?
Well, you know, even in your question, you have some of the answers. It was a mixed emotion because, you know, if you have a steady paycheck, you know, there's a level of you know, just stability there. People, you know, of course, there were opportunities that came up that even people in the industry knew that they couldn't go to him and ask him, you know, halfway through his series night, can you come and do this role, because he was, you know, he was contractual. He didn't have the time. Even though he did, I noticed on the dates, he managed to play some bit parts there somewhere that apparently didn't seem to conflict with what he was doing. He was still able to perform, you know, for the TV series and that as well. But it goes back to the question, you know, some time ago when you said, well, was this acting something that he was, you know, obsessed about? I mean, you see people interviewed now, oh my God, ever since I wanted to be two, I want to be an actor, an actress, or whatever, and this and that. And it wasn't. He didn't look at that at all. He was relatively a quiet person. Even in the States, the native people called him an Uncle Tomahawk, right? Because he didn't get out there, you know, with AIM, the American Indian Movement. He wasn't there. So he wasn't there that way in the social things, other than going visiting, you know, kids in hospitals, which was, you know, something he thoroughly enjoyed. But that attitude of recluse and just doing what he needed to do to make a living stifled his motivation to go on and say, gee, thank you, now I can go on to a bigger career. Like people get launched, right? You see people now that are on TV that suddenly they get picked up and they get on the big screen, or vice versa, or a combination of both things. But without, you know, agents then too, I mean, well, so what, you know, the film industry was around, you know, what, 30 years at that time, you know, from the 20s, you know, kind of incrementally increasing agents. I mean, what the hell did an agent know? Agents generally, you know, often worked for the guys that were hiring these people, right? They were getting paid both ways. So agents are different now. So he didn't see that, from what I understand, as any kind of an opportunity, more of a loss. You know, if there was you know, if he knew that, gee, in 5 months I'm done this, and I've got six films here that are just waiting for me, and suddenly instead of making $200-300 a week, I'm going to be getting, you know, 5,000 or 10,000. That never seemed to come up. There was no indication. Even the movies that he had done after, any parts that he did, they were bits. You know, they were bits. It's the timing too. The change of what people wanted to see on TV, and you know, that's why westerns just sort of faded away and went into your different venues, you know, on television and on the big movies, into your early, like your late 50s, your early 60s. I mean, there were huge changes that were taking place in entertainment, and new faces were coming up, new thoughts were coming up, new ideas, and so on and so forth. And where he was being typecast into that kind of native country and western and so on and so forth, the westerns and that they just faded away. When you think about what was coming up, you know, the sitcoms on television, I mean, you get things like Rawhide and that as well, but they didn't last long. It was a time, it was done, and he didn't play any catch up on that. And there were other actors coming into play that, you know, that simply overshadowed him. His timing was the timing for him then. You know, you can't, I can't imagine, and it's hard to say, I can't imagine another native person taking on that role and having the same impact because of all the other attributes that he had. You know, as a person, and being a good-looking guy, you know, this and that and everything else. He came up here, back to Six Nations quite a lot. You know, he was floating around. He got involved in with a band He toured around with the band a little bit. He was just looking at ways to, making money. And so I think that lack of enthusiasm, and that wasn't his goal. And of course, he's not athletically sought after any longer, right? He's past his prime that way. It was an opportunity other than, at this point, it's like, where can I get work?
Right.
Right. Because I don't think that even in his role as Tonto, I don't think you could look at his role as Tonto and you say, my God, those are incredible artistic pieces of work. It was entertaining. It was a combination of two. You couldn't have had him just as a Tonto character, pull off what was taking place. It was that team. It was that whole essence of it. You isolate other movie stars for something. Look at Clayton Moore. Never went on either. For a variety of reasons, he never kind of made it over that hump. Like the Lone Ranger series was the peak. Both of them came out of it making their mark in history. There's no question about that. But other than that, not much else. It was, it came down to being somewhat of a struggle. So is it a trade-off? Would you rather have been like they are marked in history for eternity, or would you have had to say, well, they played this role, but man, they went on and they did this, they got the Academy Award and so on and so forth, and they made a fortune. It's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, maybe you know the answer to this question, and if you don't know the answer, it's okay, but at one point in time, Hollywood was making feature-length motion pictures with white actors playing Native American roles. There was Chuck Connors, Burt Lancaster, Rock Hudson, Henry Brandon, white guys, but they were playing Indians. And even that ad, I think it was a pollution ad with the crying Indian, Iron Eyes Cody, you think that's a Native American because of the name, but really he's a white guy also. He's Italian, so he's not Native American at all. The name is a little bit misleading, but he's not Native American. Jay Silverheels is full-blooded Mohawk Indian, so I was always wondering why he never was in that ad. That would have been a perfect ad for him, being the Indian with the tear. But back to the main point, did that bother him that he was not getting these parts? And why not Jay Silverheels? Why wasn't he being cast in these roles?
Number one, it did bother him. That one I can answer right away. That was it did bother him for sure, because it's like anybody. It's like you and I moving to Africa, and somebody says, "Geez, we're going to have a lead character here that's going to play somebody that's from North America," and they put in a guy from the Congo. You say, "What the hell? Can you not see us?" The other roles, and from what I've been able to hear from family and that as well, Jay didn't have exactly powerful agents working for them. These other guys had these people working. They were in the circle. Jay didn't go out and as much as it to role play and all that. So they were in lieu of a native person. They said, here, you put on a little makeup. Really, when I mentioned before about, my God, John Wayne playing Attila the Hun. I've seen that movie a couple of times. I look at it because I'm still baffled. There's some other actors like Anthony Quinn. He got away with playing, kind of those roles. He had the features of it, right? Even though he was, what was he, Greek, I think, or Spanish? But one or two. He was from the Mediterranean originally. But so they just took these people on because they had the power of the agents, and it was about money too. Listen, we'll play the role, and we can put a little bit on there for you. The other part still with that stereotypical feeling about how people were going to react. The native people, there's so few that were in Hollywood at that time. Look at Little Big Man with Chief Dan George, with the role he played. With the long gray hair with Dustin Hoffman and so on. That came into the 60s. But prior to that, it was native people, can they even walk? Or they're wild, or they're lazy, or they're drunks. Still that sense about the conquest, the conquered, their place. And things like that. How can we talk to them? But a lot of it had to do with representation. Jay just did not seem to have anybody that was really serious. Look, once you get signed up into a TV series like he had, that's a no-brainer. That just continues. Beyond that, he just wasn't marketable, and he just didn't have the connections and the power to get him into these places. So if you don't have somebody that can fill that role, that's say native or for a native role, you pick somebody else that's gonna you could squeak by on. And I can't remember some of the other names too. Geronimo was played by a non-native.
Chuck Connors. Yep.
Yeah. The
Rifleman.
Exactly. And that was, I think he had blue eyes, and he was fairly tall and all. But it was just a different time. Now, obviously, now it's different again. Native people will play a native role, but they also now are much more advanced and in tune, and many finish university and so on and so forth. And take a look at it and say, "Holy Jesus, who are you portraying here?" Like, we didn't live in caves, and so on and so forth. So they have comments to be made about it as well. But back then, no, there was no comments. Somebody wrote a script for you and say, "This is the way this native acted." And so how many actors were there? Like I say, even Jay was not an actor. He didn't have that background. He didn't go through the system, right? Didn't have those credentials. And there's certain things, like people go to school and, for all that kind of stuff, and he didn't have it. So in a lot of ways, too, he wasn't, I guess, trainable, for roles. And that came out before. I mentioned that his ability or willingness, I suppose, to even read a script and memorize it, he wasn't into that
right.
as much as he should have been, Mm-hmm. But I suppose if he was making good money and he had training and so on and so forth, he probably would have had that, and then he would have had that reputation. Oh yeah, he remembers his stuff, and he's good, and he's professional, et cetera, et cetera. It probably would have led to other things.
Of the well-known Western stars, whether they were from TV or from movies, who was he friends with? Obviously, I'm sure Clayton Moore and John Hart, the two actors who played the Lone Ranger, but outside of those guys, who was he friends with?
He actually led a fairly reclusive life. When I spoke to his wife there a couple of years ago, asking about, just things, like, well, what have you done and so on. So she wasn't really much into talking about this whole other, kind of part of life, like the Hollywood. So if you don't continue being in that part of the circle, you don't get invited to things, and your friends become people that are no names, right, to the outside world. He focused time and energy with Native people, right, in the guild that he tried to start. He spent time there. Spent time with his family. Like, there's good feedback from his family in terms of the kind of dad he was. Drive his kids to school, and so on and so forth. So he, anybody that was hanging on to them, you know how it is, like, when you're a celebrity and so on, you get hangers on.
Right.
That didn't last very long at all, because Hollywood was moving really, really fast. Jonathan Winters is somebody that pushed the Hollywood star, for him. Because there's a process, my understanding, there's a process of, you actually, submit application and you make contributions. Mm-hmm. You get a star. Jonathan Winters seemed to be one of his most loyal friends that they used to hang out with. And he got into, now he loved horses, so he got into the racing of horses, right? That took him around the country. Yeah, again, up here, there are many people I bump into that he was in, we have several tracks in the area that he would come up here. So he didn't necessarily spend a lot of time, because he lived in California and that too. He spent a fair bit of time away. It was not only for his own, sort of pleasures, to go away, but it was also, to try to create that revenue, right? That dollar thing. If you're not getting work in Hollywood as a movie star, and your wife's there and your kids are there and everything else too, I suppose it's just as easy to stay there, and then one person moves around, because the family didn't seem to travel a lot at all. That just wasn't there. He seemed to do a lot of solo stuff, and yet there didn't seem to be a problem in their marriage, either. So it wasn't that. It's just that he did a lot of that. He did that as a teenager, right, from the beginnings. He was always away from home with the lacrosse, always traveling all over the place. So he had that in his blood, that's what he did. But it's not. He didn't. There wasn't a glamorous, part of it. Like there's not the fact that he had a few kids in Buffalo. There was a son. There was another one at Fort Erie, which is just on the other side of the river, close to Buffalo. A couple here on the Six Nations, and of course the three with Mary in California. He didn't seem to live a sheltered life when it came to that. He seems to have had a fair number of offspring, and
right.
and I haven't been to it, but there's about 3 or 4, I guess, on the Grand River Six Nations where they, where Jay is their father, and they get together. They have that common element, but that's about it. Famous father. It's kind of a peculiar situation, but see, it's not untypical of the evolution of First Nations overall. That he was unique, clearly, in being out there, more popular than a native person would normally be. How many black people were in that category, like in Hollywood? Jack Benny had was it Sylvester? It was just sort of like a sidekick, but there were no players like Jay. This is all new. And so some people thought it was nice to have maybe your token Indian around. Others said, no, I just don't want to have anything to do because, it's a profession. He's not adding any value. He wasn't a socialite. And outside of, a TV series, like what offerings does he have? Has he won was he even nominated? No, he wasn't, like, Academy Awards, that whole circle, right? So it was different. And then out you go, you just become a regular person with that behind you, and you're actually more famous after your death than you were in many cases during your life. It's really different. It's not like I could write a book about Wayne Gretzky, and I went to his wedding and I saw people there that he didn't have a lot of celebrities at his wedding, but he was a superstar, made the money. Even now, Wayne shows up someplace, of course, people crowd around. But his father is just as popular, right? His father had the aneurysm. Now Wally has the shakes from Alzheimer's, and it's really sad to see that. But he's quite an amazing human being. But there's a sort of like a beginning, the backyard rink, and then the being discovered, and then these. Like he was one of the highest paid players at the very, very beginning, and then moving on. Now, of course, his daughter's making some name for herself too down there, I guess, with different things, and so on and so forth. So there's a story there of that pendulum moving upwards. Financial success, notoriety, records, galore. Excuse me, Jay never had that. No, he never had that at all.
Do you think he ever missed playing Tonto post the Lone Ranger TV series, when he was struggling to find work, or even in his later days when he was not doing too well, he had suffered some strokes and he wasn't feeling well, or even right after the show ended and he was, I mean, it wasn't his favorite role, but it was a job, and I'm sure he had a lot of friends on set, and the show was very, very popular. So was there ever a point in time after the show ended, did he ever miss playing Tonto?
No, not from what I understand. Too, other than what happens, you find athletes, right? I mean, this is fairly common. Somebody's out there and they're in their heydays, et cetera, and then they're retired, and it's a sad thing, and so on. So they actually have withdrawals, right? A lot of athletes get themselves into trouble. They don't know how to deal with it because ever since they were little, they were weaned on it. Well, Jay's life was so erratic that way. I mean, he had peaks. He played lacrosse. He was a star. He wasn't. He was here. He came home. He left. He sold shoes. He sold insurance. He boxed a little bit. Goes to Hollywood, this place that might as well be on Mars, and does a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Meets some people that I'm sure it's quite fascinating meeting them. Like Humphrey Bogart or whatever. And then it's always the survival game. Again, it goes back to his family. He had a family. His wife she worked for the bank, and to the best of my knowledge, when the family started to happen, she packed the bank in. So he was the sole breadwinner, and I would imagine that they probably thought, and you'd think no reason why, that, wow, look what they just fell into. And the future is going to be, absolutely fantastic, which it never turned out to be. So it was the regular revenue. There didn't seem to be a lot of joy. I've seen this. I've been involved in a few documentaries, like little teeny things, just because of a history thing, or it's be on the site and I'd watch, so and you may have too witnessed a lot of these things, that people go in, they give their lines, they sit, they wait, and they're tired, they're getting up early, and there's these crews and ropes and wires all over the place. It's not necessarily glamorous. Look at that situation where he had to fight to get accommodations, that he had to get out of the toilet in the garage, to change. That they finally put him into something where he was treated with some kind of respect. So it was, so did he get paid every week? Yeah, he got the paycheck, and not much of one, but that would be the missing point, because the unknown factor. Okay, this is our last episode. We're done. You have no residuals on anything, even though this thing's going to play for the next 50 years. We can make all kinds of images of you. I mean, that would have been a nice thing, wouldn't it? Where you're saying, geez, I'm just not going to work for the rest of my life because I'm making more money now than I've ever, I could ever spend. It didn't happen for him. So it was not the role itself, which, as a Native person, he saw that it wasn't really consistent with how his people would have behaved. That relationship between himself and the Lone Ranger, I mean, that didn't exist in real life. The Native people here on the Six Nations, and there's even a fair bit of it today, they're isolated. To have a friend that's Native is more acceptable now than it was in the past, but there was a time that, look at Sidney Poitier, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, right? Mm-hmm. Here's this black guy shows up, and look at the awkwardness that created, even in a great movie, back then. So it's he didn't get much out of that for a long period of time, and he always felt, it seemed to me, that he was being used and abused. And when you have a brain and you feel that that's happening to you, the discontent that follows along with you, you're always suspicious. And there was that suspicion. So he tried to make his own kind of life. I think in Burford, not far from here, there was an article, a little tiny thing. They had asked Jay to be the parade marshal in this parade for something. And the comment was the next day in the issue, or a couple of days later, it said, we weren't able to match the fee that Mr. Silverheels was asking for. Well, I think it was in like the mid-60s. I think he asked for $1,000, for the one day. That was a chunk of money back then. In the 60s, people were only making, like, the average wage was about $5 or $6 grand a year. So he realized then he was going to go for a while. The getting was good, but see, so they turned him down. So he'd go out and try to get what he could. So it's untypical. On one hand, like you and I, we hold that whole thing in such high esteem, but yet the accolades and the financial rewards and the feeling and the content didn't follow. Even with Clayton Moore, when you look at things, about his comments about different things, and even, look at the mask issue. Should that have ever happened to him, where these moguls said you can't do that? You can't go out and eke out a little bit of a living from what we've capitalized on, over the years from you, and so on and so forth. Well, some say, well, that's business, right?
Right.
Well, the same with Clayton, I suppose, that at the beginning, and being non-native and being the Lone Ranger, his situation was considerably better than Tonto's, but even at that, much less than what I think he deserved, and compared to other, kind of big screen players,
Let's talk about your book, Tonto, The Man in Front of the Mask. What was your motivation for writing this book?
It was accidental. I had, when Jay was here in 1957 in Brantford, I have to go back to that because I even touch on that in the book. I went downtown and the city was full. You couldn't even see the sidewalk. He was coming into town for this parade. He was actually going to the Six Nations to open an athletic, the first digging for some stadium. And anyway, he comes to town, and I was 10. I had the opportunity to at least be pushed into his car, and I got pounced to another car behind. So I have a picture of the convertible that I got pushed away from, because he's in it, Mary's in it, and their daughter's in it, So I had that image in my mind that I got pushed into this car in behind, and there's a lady in there. I didn't recognize her. She had a little straw hat on, and I had a book with me. And I don't know how this happened, but I have this. She reached her hand out, and I gave the book to her, and I'm getting pushed by all these screaming kids and all over. I'm just a little skinny guy, and she gives me the book back, and I took it and I ran away. I ran about 2-3 blocks. I opened the book up, and in it was written something, Jay's mom. It was his mother. Mm-hmm. Well, rolling it forward a whole bunch of years, with my interest in Native history and culture and, friendships, this and that, everything else too, I was asked to do an article, because you obviously gathered from my Native Studies guide that people kind of know that I have a little bit of background. I was asked to do an article by a magazine in Toronto about him a couple of years ago. I said, okay, I can figure something out. I thought that was relatively easy, an article. Well, I started digging, and I'm thinking, oh my crap, there's bits and pieces of stuff around here, and there's maybe, I think, 3 pages in this one book I saw, along with a whole bunch of other people. I said, there's no book about him. Mm-hmm. And I said, wow, it just intrigued me. So anyway, a little time went on, and I started talking to some of my friends, and Steve Smith, who's his nephew, just chatting it up and everything else too. And then the museum here in town, they had a lot of archival photos, and of course my memory. So I thought I'm going to take a run at it. I had no intention of writing a biography about an icon. And I've got it all. I mean, the proximity, and now in the book I actually have a picture of his mother holding a little baby. Well, that little baby is my friend Steve Smith's daughter, and she's a very famous world-class dancer, Sante. And she gave me that picture, and there's that lady. There's the lady wearing a little straw hat, the way I remember her. So I had a lot of connections. As a matter of fact, the family said that nobody could have written that book with as much insight and personal connection to it than me. And that's not what I had planned. That's not what I want to do. And as I mentioned earlier, in the discovery of my Tonto, of the Lone Ranger in a way that I'd never known before, I said, oh, holy crap, I didn't know that in the TV series he was actually a Potawatomi. Mm-hmm. Oh, I didn't know this and that.
Right.
All these different things I'm piecing. Yeah, I'm having an awful lot of fun with it. And, I just got to the point, I said, well, I just have to do something with this information. And, it took me quite a while to put it in a sequence of some sort. But the connection had to be to me personally as a baby boomer. Mm-hmm. I had to put that element in, and I had to make comments related to the way I viewed things. I didn't want to go and sort of get a world opinion about certain things. I said, I have to deliver this information and be true to myself. And then, as it turned out, coincidentally, right, the movie was the remake was not launched yet. This is really interesting, and I said, holy shit. I was moving along with getting it together and then getting it printed, so as it turned out, the book was delayed a little bit, so then I was able to add a little bit about my commentary in the book itself. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned earlier, speak to the artist that did that composite, and have some drawings made, and there it is. And now, apparently, like I say, with the Gretzky Sports Hall of Recognition, it's in a glass case. It's in the museum archives, and it's become launched into a part of Lone Ranger history, and specifically Tonto. So that's how it worked out. And I still sit here and I say, wow. How'd that ever happen? and it did. And not being a writer, I mean, I'm not people say, oh, I've written 4 books, I've got the names started. I said, hold back on calling me an author. I said, look, I have my way of putting things together. My books are kind of folkish. I didn't have them professionally edited. I mean, I think I have friends that are teachers. I said, look, just check it out for kind of grammar and this and that and everything else too. I said, but I have a sequence. Nobody's going to... I'll listen to people, in the rough draft. I said, take a look at this. Does this make sense? So at the beginning of it with my friends, the sitting there, the pulling information together that we walked around. I know where Jay's ashes are spread. I know the church I was there. I know where his family's cemetery stones are. I had a lot of good information, a lot of good insight, and a lot of fun in doing that. And so here it is. And now I'm talking to you.
Now that you've written a book on his life, you've done the research, and you also, like you touched on it, you have that nostalgia being a baby boomer. You remember him, seeing him when he came to visit, and then also watching him on TV for many, many years. I'm very curious to know, when you think of Jay Silverheels, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Wow.
Holy smokes. There's a residential school that the bill started, and I just go back into him being, oh boy, a connection goes back a while. It's just that his situation is so unique. There's a little bit of sadness there, and there's a little bit of joy. There's just that memories, like we had spoken about his place in history that he went into unwillingly, and yet it's inescapable for him, and what he did. First thing that comes to mind is there's a guy that just was called all kinds of names when he was little, grew up with seemingly a lot of disadvantages, and was at the right place at the right time, I suppose, because I can't see I couldn't imagine another road for him to follow other than him, work on business or being whatever, picking up a trade, and never ending up in the United States. So, look at Joey Brown. What the hell, Joey Brown didn't show up at that game in California. The rest of it would have not happened. So it's just this individual, this individual that belongs to a certain race, and at a time when it wasn't an advantageous time for anybody of his culture to make a move, and yet he made a move. And like a little icebreaker, that he chug-a-lugged through this thing, and I don't think there was any intent in it. And I guess when I say the icebreaker, kind of broke the ice for a lot of First Nations actors. Now, we have a lot out there, we know. I mean, there are a lot of great First Nations actors, a lot that are mixed blood, because obviously, as you know, over the last 300-400 years, there's been a lot of mixed blood. Some people don't even look or, that they have any native blood in them, but they do. Johnny Depp claims to have a little bit, right, for example.
Right.
James Brown, for Pete's sakes, has Cherokee blood. I mean, a soul, one of my favorite soul singers, he said Cherokee. So it's not just a one-word answer. It's just that sitting and thinking and saying, there's this human being who just figured out how to act just a normal life, not privileged, and yet there's these little gems that you pull out, that are real, and he's affected an awful lot of people, right? Collective, on his own, or connected, obviously, in parallel with Clayton Moore, in that whole series.
If he was alive today, and you could sit down and talk to him, what would you ask him? Now that you've written this book about him and you've done all this research, what would you ask him?
Wow. What a damn good question. If he was alive today and he knew what was going on today, and I'd say, Jay, like comparing your life when you're a kid and you're seeing the life the way it is now for kids, specifically to do with Native people, I think other than its acting and everything else too, I'd say, do you think that we're going in the right direction? That whole sense of the Lone Ranger, remember you and I talked about it, about that, accepting cultures and there's right, there's wrong, etc., etc. I'd say, Jay, are we moving in the right direction? Are we doing pretty good as a society? And then possibly, and of course the other side is I'd probably start asking him questions because I'd be curious. It's like when I see Wayne on occasion, I'd say, hey, did you meet so-and-so? What are they like?
Right.
So when I ran Wayne's tournament, I met guys like Jamie Farr, John Candy, Alan Thicke, Rob Lowe, and so on and so forth. So I got a sense a little bit of what these people were like. Some were assholes and some were really nice.
Right.
But the same thing, the curiosity, like what was Humphrey Bogart like, what was Clayton Moore like, really, like, and so on and so forth. I think I'd be curious about his sense, and I think I'd probably listen a little bit in terms of how he felt he was treated, as a Native person, thousands of miles away from his home, and even questions like you'd ask me, like, what did he feel that might do for his future? Did he see it going on someplace? As a guess, because there's not much that's known about him, really. So these questions are so varied. Many of the same questions you asked me is probably what I'd ask him to get a little bit more in depth.
Right.
Knowledge.
Zig, last question. What's his legacy?
I think his legacy is that I think that he was at the cutting edge of opening up opportunities for First Nations people, and actually anybody that's of color, that's say not of European extraction, so that somebody has to be there. Somebody, and he was one of the first ones.
Zig, real quick before I let you go, tell the people where they can go buy this book, Tonto, The Man in Front of the Mask, or where they can go to buy some of your other books, and tell the people where they can keep up with you on social media, your website, stuff like that. Give the plug. Where can people go to keep up with everything you have going on?
Well, my website, which is realpeopleshistory.com, my book's available there. I've shipped out a few books down to you folks, but it's like $30 to ship it. I have about 62 locations here in Ontario because I support independent bookstores, museums, and historic sites. I will not deal with chapters in indigo. I refuse it. It's just on principle because I print my books in North America. I don't want to. That's again me. They can download them on ebook versions online. I think they're only a couple of bucks. They're not going to show as well as the hard copy, but I'm certainly prepared to ship a hard copy signed to anybody. But it's realpeopleshistory.com is my website.
Zig, thank you for taking the time to talk. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciated it too. I really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you very much.